Shabbat Shalom. There's an excitement that I have to see you here this morning. And not just to see you, but to see you. Because I don't know about you, but I have been in moments where I've not been able to see anything. Has anyone here ever had a moment where you have been in a sudden blackout, where the electricity's all gone off, and suddenly everything is pitch black? We would have that on occasion growing up. We got used to having the candles ready for the time when the lights would go out, and you wouldn't quite know where things were. Or perhaps you walk into an unfamiliar space, and it's completely dark. And you're groping around for the light switch, because when you see things dimly, it can be hard to know quite what is in the room. And your imagination can take over. Fear of the dark is a very common fear because it is in part fear of the unknown. We can imagine all sorts of things that might be surrounding us when we're in the dark. We gain a whole new perspective when the light is turned on. And there's a story that has done the rounds of a kind of changed perspective. It was started kind of getting shared on the internet about 20 years ago. It's not a true story, but you might have seen it claiming as such, but it's basically an illustration. It's a foggy night, and there is a Navy ship on the sea. And all of a sudden, the ship makes out in the distance a light. And as it's coming closer to the light, it notices that the light is not moving out of its way. Now, I don't know a lot about the Navy or boat etiquette, but I do know, and I should know living in San Diego, that smaller vessels need to get out of the way of bigger vessels. That's the rule, right? Yes. If you're in a kayak or paddleboarding in the bay, you get out of the way. And you especially get out of the way when there's a Navy ship bearing down on you. And so the chief of the naval operations on the ship got on the radio and made the following conversation happened. The Navy ship said, "Please divert your course, strange light, 15 degrees to the north to avoid a collision." The unknown light responded, "We recommend you divert your course 15 degrees to the south to avoid a collision." The Navy ship said, "This is the captain of a U.S. Navy ship, the largest in the entire fleet. So I say to you again, divert your course." And the mystery light said, "We are a lighthouse. It's your call." Sometimes something can happen that will shift our perspective a little bit. What we thought and imagined and the acts we were taking because we imagined things a certain way, suddenly we get some new information or new light and everything shifts. We are in a sermon series about the Advent. And we have encouraged you to start hearing a phrase that we're going to be repeating in this series, but also in the weeks and months to come, this phrase in light of the Advent. If you are here for the first time, you might have seen on the front of our church the words Paradise Valley Seventh-day Adventist Church. Because this word Advent is very important for us as a community. Advent, we have shared, means coming or arrival. And we as Adventists are people who center our identity on the Advent, on the coming of God. But as we've been talking over this series, we're inviting us to remember that this word Advent doesn't only point to a future, but we have hope in the future because this word Advent includes so much. And so in our very first week of this series, we invited us to remember that the Advent is past and present and future. Pastor Walter helped us remember that God connects with us in our present to remind us of what we've done in our past so that we can believe He's capable of doing what He says He will do in the future. Amen. We have hope in the Advent because the Advent is the God who has come and is coming and will come again. And so this leads us into the second point that we talked about last week. We invited us to think about when we hear the word Advent, to remember this. Advent reminds us that God comes first. God is always moving towards us first. God is the God who took 7 buses to get to us. God is the God who bridges the gap first. And last week we spoke about love, how we love because He first loved us. So we think about the past, present, and future when we think about the Advent. We know that God comes first when we think about the Advent. And today I want to speak specifically about when we say the word Advent, it's not just a theme, but I want to speak about the content of what is arriving. When we hear the word Advent, I want us to think God with us. The Advent is basically this, that the God who comes first to be with us is with us. God with us. So today, in light of the Advent, this is what we are proclaiming. We know that God is with us. It's a paradigm shift. To a world that's saying, get out of our way, we're the biggest, baddest Navy ship around. The response is, this is our lighthouse. This is the point. It's solid ground. It's an unshakable truth. God is with us. And it's also, though, remarkable that this unshakable truth takes the form of a little baby, tiny and vulnerable and born in the town of Bethlehem 2,000 years ago. Something that could be easy for people to overlook. It's a tiny pinprick of light. But as we draw closer, it reveals some really important truths. So today I want to talk about the profound implications of this reality that God is with us. The first week we talked about how the fact of the Advent can bring us hope. Last week we talked about how the fact of God coming to be with us and God coming first fills our hearts with love because God first loved us. And today I want to talk about peace. That God with us brings peace. Does anybody long for peace? Anybody experiencing a little bit of chaos right now? You just need to take a look at the headlines. I looked at the headlines this past week, and there is warnings of a winter of severe illness and death coming from the White House. There is a reminder of last week's typhoon or last week's tornado in the Midwest, and how one factory worker's bosses didn't let them leave the factory. They needed to get out of the way of the tornado, and they wouldn't let them leave. They said, if you leave, you'll be fired. What priorities do people have? There's been a typhoon in the Philippines. We look around and there's worldwide chaos. There's a map of conflicts in the world. Half the world is in war. There's chaos and conflict that swirls around us in the world, and there's also chaos and conflict much closer to home. Many of us may be going home to families with wonderful dynamics, and it's filled with a time of joy and peace and harmony. But many of us might have some complications in our families. One psychologist said it like this: it's dubbed the most wonderful time of year, but not for everyone. Christmas can be a time of joy and happiness for many, but what about those who come from difficult families? Families with difficult members, or addictions, or feuds. Christmas is a time when all that comes to the forefront. Hope can be a place of comfort and security, but when you think about going back and having a Christmas fight, well, that doesn't really fill you up with peace and joy. Christmas can make strained relationships impossible to ignore, because when we talk about Christmas, we paint a picture of everything going beautifully well, and so instead, it's difficult to ignore challenging dynamics. And it's challenging every year for those who have these difficult relationships at home, but it can be particularly difficult this year. This past week, actually 2 days ago, an article came out in one of the major magazines in the US. And its title was, "Why 1,320 Therapists Are Worried About Mental Health in America Right Now." It starts by saying, as Americans head into a third year of pandemic living, therapists around the country are finding themselves on the front lines of a mental health crisis. Social workers and psychologists and therapists are saying they can't keep up with the people asking for help. It's like nothing we've ever seen. Every available time slot I have is filled. Couples are struggling. Our kids are struggling. A 10-year-old boy I worked with came up with the word sad panic mode to describe his general experience. This one independent social worker says, "I now use this phrase with other kids and it resonates." The reality is there are some very real, very difficult challenges, and we're facing them on many fronts. Concerning weather and earthquakes and exhaustion and burnout and family dynamics and pressure and this swirl. And so today, when I stand in front of you and say this proclamation, God with us brings peace, this is a dramatic statement. But it's not just my words. See, this is declared in the Christmas story, and it's mentioned from many years before Jesus comes. We heard it in the little video that we started off with, that Isaiah, hundreds of years before Jesus came, said that there will be a wonderful counselor, a Prince of Peace. And you hear this word peace echoed in the story in the very first chapter of Luke. People are preparing a way, giving them hints. Something is coming. And so when the angel appears to Zechariah and says, "Your child will prepare a way for someone," Zechariah praises God and says, "Because of the tender mercy of our God, by which the rising sun will come to us from heaven to shine on those living in darkness and in the shadow of death, he will guide our feet into paths of peace." The glory of the angels appear to the shepherds and say, "Glory to God in the highest heaven, and to earth peace be to all." Simeon, when Jesus is born, takes the baby in his arms and says, "God, as you have promised, you may now dismiss your servant in peace, for my eyes have seen your salvation." Later, after Jesus has grown and has lived and died and been raised again, Paul writes these words in Ephesians chapter 2, verse 14. He says, "For he himself is our peace." For he himself is our peace. This is an important concept here. That peace is not just a theme, but peace is a person. Peace is not just the absence of pain or hurt or noise. Peace is a person. Peace is a person. You can say that to the person next to you. Peace is a person. Peace is a person. Peace is a person. This is a profound idea that peace is a person, but it's not brand new. There is an idea of a type of personality or a type of presence that can bring calm to a situation. Several years ago, a rabbi by the name of Edwin Friedman, who was a family therapist and rabbi, was working with families during the Cold War and the economic downturns and families with lots of pressure, and he was working with them over and over and over again, and he wasn't seeing any changes in the dynamics. He would meet with the family, they would sit with him, then they would go back and the situation would keep on going, then they'd come back, and he was getting really disillusioned by the whole thing. But then he started focusing his efforts during family therapy on what he called the most non-anxious presence in the room. Sometimes it was a child, sometimes it was a parent. But he said once he started focusing on a non-anxious presence and teaching that person how to keep not being anxious, even when the situation gets chaotic, he said he saw remarkable results. That the whole system started becoming calm again. A non-anxious presence can help the entire situation calm down. When I was in college, we had a group of friends over at my house, and we were playing some games, and one of my friends, as he was getting up and moving, he was moving a little too enthusiastically, and he fell. And he started yelling and clutching his knee. And as I looked down to his kneecap was here, and his knee was facing that way. I tried to remain calm, but I will say I did not. Because I was trying to figure out, do we call the ambulance or not? On the one hand, he's screaming in pain, but on the other hand, ambulances are very expensive. And I didn't know whether he wanted us to call one or not. And so I was like, do you want us to call an ambulance? And he said, ah! And I said, do you want us to call an ambulance? And he said, ah! And as I was going back and forth, getting more anxious with him telling me whether he wanted me to call an ambulance, one of our friends, calm, cool, and collected, called the ambulance. And I thought to myself, I reflected back on that moment thinking, I did not really help this situation. He was not in a moment to be able to answer the question. Sometimes we are like that in chaotic situations, aren't we? The temperature starts rising, people start getting more anxious, and our anxiety starts rising. And we start to get more anxious. And we yell back and forth, what do you want me to do? Well, what do you want to do? Why did you say this? Well, why did you say this? And have you ever been in the presence of somebody who just calms the situation down? The story is told in Mark and in Matthew and in Luke of a man who calmed a situation completely. The disciples are with Jesus, and Jesus has been sharing all sorts of parables and stories to a crowd of people. And Jesus says to his disciples, "Come, let's get into the boat, because we're going to cross over to the other side." So the disciples get into the boat with him, and there's some other boats there, and they start crossing the Sea of Galilee. Jesus is tired, and he falls asleep. And as he does so, a storm comes up. And the waves are high, and they're crashing over the boat. And the disciples are getting more and more anxious, until finally they wake Jesus up and says, "Master, do you not care if we drown?" And Jesus gets up, and what does he do? Does he get panicked? Does he join the chaos? He says, "Peace, be still," and stillness descends. And at that point, the disciples wonder to themselves, who is this who can bring peace even with the stormy seas? This Christmas story is a story of someone who can bring peace to the craziest storms, calm to the most chaotic situation. He can be a non-anxious presence in the midst of anxiety. And I have an invitation to you in this moment. It's an invitation for each of us to try and be non-anxious presences this next week. Last week I gave you an invitation to practice love in your family, to think of a way to reach out to your spouse, to your children, to your parents, and do a specific act, a loving act for them that you think of. How can I try and show my love to this person? This week, as we lead up to Christmas, I'm going to invite you to think of how to be an ambassador of peace. Perhaps you're in a situation where the stress of not having all the Christmas presents together is causing chaos. How can you be an ambassador of peace in that moment? Or perhaps there are family dynamics, there is chaos, there is concern. How can you be a non-anxious presence in that moment? These realities, there's a story told of a chaplain who was in a really difficult situation with a family. Their older mother had just died, and he was there trying to comfort them and explain the situation. They were in a hospice, and the challenge was there was a lot of strained dynamics between the family and the mother. And he was hearing all sorts of stories about how difficult the mother was and just how challenging the relationships had been, and there was a lot of anxiety, and there was a particular request that the family had for this chaplain. The mother had just passed away, and she needed to be prepared or made looking like she was restful. But the family didn't want to do it. They were too scared. And so they asked this chaplain, "Can you prepare our mother? Can you make her look comfortable?" The chaplain had never done this before. He was feeling a lot of anxiety, but he said, "Of course." The family left the room. He made the mom, he called the person who he needed to speak to, made the mom look comfortable. The family came back into the room, and everything just calmed down. And they remembered the happy stories and the loving moments together. A presence of peace and calm in an anxious world. We can try and do this, friends. But this isn't the only thing, because our ability to stay calm in an anxious world only goes so far if we rely on our own strength. I heard a sermon once about this moment of Jesus crossing over the Sea of Galilee and a storm coming up. And in that sermon, the person pointed out why Jesus might have asked his disciples, "O ye of little faith, why are you afraid?" And they said he might have asked his disciples, "Why are you afraid?" Because it seems like they forgot what Jesus said in the very beginning of that story. Do you remember what Jesus said in the very beginning of this story that I just shared? Jesus is with his disciples. He gets into the boat and he says what? This is before the storm. He gets into the boat and says, "Let us go to the other side." We're going to the other side, Jesus says. He didn't say, "Let's go to the other side on a smooth ride with no storms." He didn't say, "Let's go to the other side and have everything be perfect." But he said, "We're going to the other side." The disciples forgot that. Jesus had said they'd make it to the other side. That was his destination. That was his goal. That's where he was going. We can be non-anxious presences as much as possible, but only because at the heart of this Christmas story is the Prince of Peace who has crossed over to the other side. The God of heaven who has come over the gap, bridged the gap, and come to be here with us. There is a bridge in Ireland, in the town of Derry. Well, it's called Derry on one side of the river. It's called Londonderry on the other side of the river. Because this town has two distinct parts that are completely separate. One side of the river was Protestant, one side of the river was Catholic. And their anger and hatred towards each other was so strong that they were fighting each other and killing each other for many, many years. And so, when peace came, there was an initial peace of two sides that were separate from each other. You go do your thing, we'll go do our thing, and let's never meet. Let's imagine that this is the river, and this half of the church would do its own thing, and this half of the church would do its own thing. For many years, there'd been fighting between, but now there was an absence of conflict. It's a good first step, right? No one's killing each other. But the thing is that the word for peace, shalom, that we said, the Hebrew word for peace is not just an absence of conflict. The Hebrew word for peace means that things are in the right relationship with each other, that things have been made right, that what was once chaotic and divided have been brought back together. So in this city or town, there was step one of peace. People stopped killing each other. But the one side of the river would never mix with the other. And so the city officials came together and said, what if we build a bridge? Not a bridge for cars, a walking and biking bridge, so that people would actually see each other, cross over, go to the other side. Now the thing is, you can build a bridge, and they did, but you need people willing to cross over. And so this was the hope. Build a bridge and have people willing to be bridge walkers, peacemakers, walking across it together. We think sometimes when we look around that the world is chaotic. It is. This is a picture, if you can't quite tell, of threads just tossed on a table. If you've ever tried to do any knitting or sewing or anything involving the making of garments, you know that this is a nightmare. When the threads all get mixed up together, tangled and chaotic. There's a difference between threads that are just tossed on top of each other and threads that are taken together, interwoven together, and made into something beautiful. One illustration invites us to think of peace or shalom like a tapestry, something that is woven together into something that looks beautiful. A picture of harmony and peace. Church family, as we go and continue getting closer to Christmas, we have this profound reality and story that God is creating shalom, that God has bridged the divide and is weaving us together. It is an invitation that when we think about the Advent, the past, present, future, the God who comes to us, the God who is with us, we are invited to reflect on the fact that this brings peace. Peace in the presence of chaos. And we can look at the chaos in our lives and know that because of Christ, peace is assured. Peace is present. Peace is a person. You bow your heads with me for prayer. Our gracious God, our wonderful counselor, our Prince of Peace. God, in the midst of all the busyness and chaos of our lives and the crises of the world, God, may we remember that you are the Prince of Peace, that you have bridged the divide, that you are our peace, and that you are knitting us together. You have brought shalom. God, I pray that as we go from here, we too can be agents of peace. We can have our eyes fixed on you and be calm in the face of whatever is going on, God, because we know that you have come to the other side and you will come to take us home. We thank you and we praise your holy name. Amen. Amen and Shabbat Shalom.